deeply unequal situations. So how can the research be matched up with the needs of community groups, the timing of that? Just because you're starting your PhD doesn't mean to say anyone really wants to talk to you. Can learning across different contexts comparatively become too abstract for the very immediate needs of community groups? And really here the question is, what drives building connections? Why would we start to link one struggle here and one struggle there? What's the point? So I can move this on.
You might need to click it saying we had this issue the other day.
Oh, thanks. Pick up. Okay, great. So just to jump in on the comparative aspect, I've been making a very general argument that comparative urban analysis is a really important way to take forward a decolonial project within urban studies. How do we start to build understandings from either contexts? This runs alongside a lot of other initiatives within the field, from, say, feminist or Black urban studies, from regional studies in different contexts, from people trying to think from the global south or whatever. So many initiatives trying to dislodge any kind of hegemony in urban studies. And I think we share a lot of challenges, in which I've argued there's quite an imperative to think across different contexts. So concepts can be revisable. We could start in any place, not be dragooned into thinking from only certain iconic places. That we can decenter the subject of theorization, but always in a way, for me, that allows conversations to continue across the global urban. Next slide, please. So I have to do it that way. Doesn't seem to be operating. And then the other aspect of this, which I mentioned, is my own background in South African geography, which drew me into working in a way that was motivated by the politics of the urban context I'm living in and by the imperatives of community movements. And here to acknowledge some of the starting points for me, which were this wonderful duality between Marxist urban theory, which I learned from Jeff McCarthy in South Africa, who was a student of Kevin Cox's. So we had really a very robust Marxist training, very well schooled and all that. And Jeff was one who was really a great mentor in leading initiatives to engage with community groups in a moment which was highly politicized and at times dangerous. So he really trained us in that. And on the other side, a dear colleague who passed away last year, Diane Scott, who trained us in thinking theoretically and engaging with whatever ideas we liked and building our understandings from our own context. So between these two starting points, I think for me a trajectory of work continued, and this is a nice collection here, Knowing the City, edited by Varnett, Sophie Oldfield and Alice Lenchi, who have drawn together a lot of South African scholars who are reflecting on their pathways into geography and urban studies and some of the politics of that over a few generations. So people who are considerably older than me and newer scholars, and the different ways in which people have engaged theoretically from a situated context and politically engaging. And in that, I was lucky enough to be asked to offer a few insights on that and tracking some of these early moments in which, inspired by Jeff and I, starting to work alongside ratepayers associations, refusing removal, think and theorize the experience of urban politics in South Africa as opposed to, for example, Castells' work, which we're very influenced by. So that's a very deep trajectory for me. And, oh, great. And I guess we can track that over time. So this post over there, 1984, this was probably one of my first overtly political acts, which was as a fairly ignorant young white student to go wandering around areas of Indian South African residences to try and convince people not to vote in elections which were racially divided, but a little bit more inclusive than just white elections, having separate parliaments for colored and Indian origin people. And then in the meantime, I was busy studying and very inspired to become like my teachers in the sense of having the status and standing and intellectual authority to say this removal is not right. There's 10 reasons why it shouldn't, and Dr. Jenny Robinson says so. So that was really one of my main motivations for studying. And then returning to South Africa in 1990 was really a very exciting time. A lot of tension around whether the transition was going to work out, or in where I was living, KwaZulu-Natal, was actually quite violent. But I became involved in the local ANC branch and very involved in electioneering at that time. I made some efforts to do some critical engaged work with the nature of the transition and politics of urban development. At that time in Durban, a growth coalition was being forged between the old government, the ANC, and various other industrial actors. Durban's a very industrial city. And I was told in no uncertain terms that now was not the time for critique. Now was the time to join in the transformation of the state, which is perhaps reasonable, but I felt that space for intellectual independence remained important. But people have been really navigating that pathway in South Africa for some time, and I left South Africa in 1996, retained a lot of close contacts back and forth all the time. But colleagues who remained, and here a book from Sue Parnell, Egert Peters, and others, in which I have a chapter, really grappled with that tension between offering a critical intellectual voice and becoming part of a transitional government. So these are not straightforward situations. In the spirit of the post-apartheid movement, so now we're zooming ahead through the 2000s, cities in South Africa were very divided. They were fragmented by race, not just in terms of spatial form, but in terms of municipal government. So each spatial area had its own municipality or administrative area, and there were multiple white municipalities competing with one another, for example. So this moment in the 1990s was the consolidation of municipal government at a uni-city level, integrating everybody. One city, one tax base had been the call for a very long time. So at that moment, municipalities had to work out, well, what do we stand for? What are we going to be? All of us together, finally, with good resources, actually. So South Africa's got a very robust property tax-based system, which is concentrated into the municipalities, so they can look across the city at the needs. And so I became very interested in city strategies as a way of accessing the complex politics of a transition, and really continuing in the sort of the training I'd received from the 1980s about the politics of local economic development, influenced by Cox and Harvey and so on, trying to understand the nature of the contestations and interests. And this also is where connection with policy mobilities comes in, because people sitting in Joburg are imagining a vision for their city, but it's done in the midst of so many possible ideas. So I followed this very closely for quite some time. And one of the things, next slide, please. One of the things I was very impressed by was the capacity of the municipal officials and consultants in Johannesburg to really draw together ideas into something very original, very driven by their own context, very responsive to the needs of that place. And so far from being a kind of neoliberalizing, pro-capital agenda, many of the city strategies from that era took a very broad view across all the line departments, all the functions and interests and concerns of municipalities, and thinking about a wide range of goals, including, for example, proactive absorption of the poor. In Durban, for example, they did a similar exercise, and their goal was to try and make a situation so that if somebody moved to the city from a deep rural area and was very poor, had no income, that they could survive without any income on the basic offer of the municipality. So there was a really progressive and positive desire around this time through the 2000s and to the early 2010s. Now, this drew me to think comparatively, partly because of the policy mobility question. That is, Johannesburg was developing its city strategy not in isolation, but in relation to many, many city strategies and many, many ideas about how to do housing, how to do redistribution, and so on. And this was quite formalized in the case of city strategies, in that the Cities Alliance and the United Cities and Local Government Organization internationally promoted city strategies very strongly as a way for poor cities to organize collaborative and inclusive visioning about the city future. And this had a very hopeful element in the sense, perhaps, that Patsy Healy talks about how spatial strategies might hold redistributive and social justice goals as they're developed collaboratively. And the policy mobility went in two directions. On the one hand, things arrived in Johannesburg. They did feel, a number of interviewees I talked to, including our current president, who had been involved in some moments of the transition in Johannesburg, they felt that they'd invented the city strategy. It's a very South African idea. You bring together all the different constituencies, labor, capital, industry, different political parties, communities, etc., and you really negotiate a vision. And they felt this had come out of the transitional politics of South African cities, which were trying to integrate and vision. But in fact, I also heard another story about how this came out of consultants arriving in Barcelona to talk about how they're going to do the Olympic regeneration there, and then this circulated a lot around the Middle East, for example, and in that way influenced UCLG. So it's a wonderful policy mobility story because there's many origins and things go in all kinds of directions. Now, the direction that Johannesburg's experience of city strategies went in was partly a developmental initiative. So the UCLG and the Cities Alliance created a sort of framework, a map, if you like, formula for how to do city strategies anywhere. So get information, get a local task force, blah, blah, blah. So, you know, it's a sort of formula for doing city strategies. And Joburg did this so well that the UCLG made an initiative through Habitat International to promote the circulation of that experience through sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the places that they promoted that was through Lilongwe, also Zambia, Namibia, Mozambique, etc. So there was a meeting in about 2007 bringing together South African municipalities and Southern African municipalities to think about how to support city strategies as a way to improve governance and develop agendas in those contexts. And here, Johannesburg became involved with Lilongwe in Malawi and supported interactions, spent a lot of their own money and time to help Lilongwe develop a city strategy, try and deal with some severe governance issues, a lot of corruption and non-attendance of anybody at anything really. So they worked so very hard to support that initiative in Malawi. And in fact, it influenced me a lot because I learned a lot from the Johannesburg officials who engaged in that very developmental initiative and have since followed up with work in Malawi myself. So here the other direction of comparison was that I was living in London and I moved my workplace to London, where at UCL I came across one of the most inspiring academics in my career, which has been Michael Edwards from the Bartlett School of Planning, who I know Loretta's also worked very closely with. And I discovered that there was an organization called Just Space, which is a network of community-based organizations across the city. And their main effort was to try and engage with the London plan, various iterations of that there, which is a metropolitan-wide, well, the sort of area of the mayor, so administrative area, a spatial plan which integrates the different functional roles of the mayor into a spatial, strategic plan. And the Just Space were doing amazing work, bringing together communities from across London and delving into the detail of these plans, which can be quite technical, quite challenging. And really community, what you realize is that community groups are exceedingly well informed and very well focused on how to analyze and critique policy from their personal experiences, from the community experiences and so on. And then to engage in what is an extremely formal process, but because it's a plan, it comes into the planning systems process of evidence in public and review by planning inspectors. So this provides an opportunity for communities to sit down alongside local authorities, business leaders, major think tanks, and try and put their voice into this arena So I became very interested in thinking about the London plan as another city strategy alongside places like Johannesburg and London. Aside from that, there was a lot of activity going on with Just Space, and this is, I think it's another slide. I have one of your pamphlets. Yes, but yeah, this is one of my former PhD students, Lucy Taylor, was involved in a sort of community-based network to try and develop ideas about how to make a diverse economy, to have some space in the city, literally. This is an initiative. UCL was very involved with Just Space. This is an initiative to bring a number of London universities together to do the same kind of work, supporting and engaging with Just Space. And then one thing that Michael and I did was, for about 10 years, we ran a course in which students were advised and commissioned, really, very directly and taught by community-based actors from the Just Space network, and engaging with all kinds of policy issues and local area activities, with the long-term view to support contributions to the London plan at the times it happened. So there were some student contributions in 2012 and in 2019, supporting communities, working with them to develop the form of words, and actually presenting at the London plan hearings. And this was really got a lot of very positive responses from the planners. Not everything we said did. So with Just Space, we learned an awful lot. Quite early in the collaboration, Just Space developed a research protocol. How can communities and researchers work together? It's often a very fraught relationship. Lowest common denominator would be students or academic arrives and community declares they're researching this, asks community for interviews, information, blah, blah, then runs away, writes their thesis and never seen again. So Just Space had really had a lot of that, and people were very interested in continuing with that kind of thing. So this has been something that I think we've all tried to work with, share with our students. And there's a kind of summary of this kind of extended protocol. You can look it up. But there are things like prepare well before you go, don't just arrive with no idea. Consult with people before you start doing things, interviewing and etc. Integrate people into your planning, research design, secure consent. Amazing how many people don't do that. And return with your insights to ask about what you're learning. Use accessible language. People also interested in challenging existing theories, not just having you impose stuff on them, but learning from the informed understandings that people have from their own context. And that's certainly something I found very rewarding. And be prepared to contribute. And I think this is something that's so important to Just Space practice. Be prepared to use your own time and effort to engage and learn through your contributions. And I know, Loretta, you've done an awful lot of that. And then they suggest share your findings quickly. So if you bring them back 2 years later, the whole thing has changed. So come back quickly with provisional ideas and talk about them. So as we were engaging with the London plan, one of the issues that came up very strongly for me was what in London we call opportunity areas. So these started off as big parts of the city which were deindustrialized. So London, if you know a little about the geography of it, had a huge docklands going along the river to the east. And this became obviously redundant and it's not really made docks in the sense it was during the East India Company and so on and so forth. And also the deindustrialization of the city. So like many large cities, Boston too, I think, and Paris, you have massive areas of the city which are just full of warehouses, dilapidated, what to do with it and so on. So that's how the opportunity areas began. Few of in the beginning, they were like that. And, you know, we can see maps of this from even 1997, for example. It's a very long-standing thing in London. But it's got a bit out of control, frankly. So here we have, there's about 45 in this map. There's probably more being declared since then. And somebody arrives and just draws a red line around a place and starts doing things there, you know, not asking or telling you or whatever. So the community groups were very concerned in their round of engagements with the previous London plan. Again, you know, they've been engaging on this issue for a long time, that the opportunity areas are designated from above, and that they're really not yielding the kind of housing that's needed. They're yielding horrible neighborhoods, tall buildings, dense, no social housing, etc. So we became connected to some communities who were becoming mobilized in this area of Old Oak, which is around here in West London, who had been declared an opportunity area relatively recently, where they were facing a massive new development. So this area is a lot of old industrial area, old railway lines, but also one of the largest industrial areas left in London. In fact, they said sometimes in Europe. So massive transformation was expected here because of the much heralded HS2 high-speed 2 rail line, which is meant to go from central London to central Manchester. Now it seems to be going from Old Oak to somewhere in Birmingham or thereby. So it's been very controversial as an initiative, but it's driven this massive, ambitious development in West London, which has been causing a lot of challenge to people. I mean, you can just see this sense of it here, this little neighborhood here in the middle of new railway lines, massive high buildings and so on. So we started, as part of the course, we started to get involved. So yeah, you see a picture of one of the very first community meetings where different neighborhood groups, different interest groups, friends of the parks, Wormwood Scrubs, a big park there, very unspoiled, and different residents' communities came together to start to think about this issue and think about forming a network, which they then did. So this next picture here is one of our conferences to discuss how to engage with the local plan process. And you see here the local plan itself. And one of, I don't know, it must be about 200 or 300 studies done to support the local plan. So really the question is, how does a small embattled community engage with the planning process with so much to analyze? And there, I think sometimes supportive students and academics and professionals in the area can be really helpful. So we worked in a whole lot of people, and community people worked really hard to engage with the local plan process, which ended up in this very, again, quite formal situation here. The inspector listening to comments and concerns about how the plan should be worded. Now, one of the wages of the Just Space Initiative with the London plan was that it would help community groups in this situation to be able to draw down some of the wording that the community had got inserted into the London plan to try and affect how they operated in each context. And so how can engaging in the London plan help? So from the Old Oak perspective, it helped a little bit. The question is, do we have any success in trying to do that? So we had a little bit of success, a little bit it helped at Old Oak. So on the one hand, we had some success in critiquing the way in which targets were being set for these opportunity areas. So somebody just kind of draws a line around an area of the city and then says, okay, here there should be 25,000 new houses, 60,000 new jobs. No work done for that really. So setting these targets then gets put into the London plan and then imposes itself on the local plan. So in Old Oak, the planners kept on saying, well, in the London plan, it says here we must have 25,000 jobs, houses. So they have to design that into their local initiative, which is very pressurizing, very demanding, especially since the leftover industrial, post-industrial areas in London are very hard to develop. The easy ones have already been done. These ones are hard. They've got bad levels. Everything needs remediation. There's a lot of important uses, churning trains around so you can get back on the track. Quite an important thing to have in a city. So it becomes more difficult. So we did have some success, and I worked very hard on that with Just Space to say that targets need to be indicative and they have to be tested before they can be imposed on local plan. But unfortunately, the planners from Old Oak argued that, well, they've already done that and they had to be in conformity with the last London plan and blah, blah, blah. So it didn't help us there. We failed completely to shift the wording on what should be funded. And I'll show you a little bit how that works in London in a minute. So the mayor established a policy, DF1D, which I personally targeted a lot. This policy said, first of all, if you're doing a development, you must provide for transport infrastructure and affordable housing. After that, you can do any kind of social housing, etc., social infrastructure or community needs and so on. And the housing targets don't prioritize social housing really, but prioritize intermediate and high-end, not very affordable housing. So we completely failed there. Nobody believed us. I was accused of being a Marxist in the middle of the discussion. So well, okay, it's true, but not really. So, and then we had a little bit of success about social infrastructure, because the thing about these huge high-rises is, where do kids play? Where do people find parks? How do you make space and money for the kinds of basic things communities need? And we did manage to get some new words inserted about how playgrounds, for example, I had a younger child at this time, so I was quite agitated about this, that people designing the only play spaces on the roof of 55-story buildings. It's absurd. So we inserted some language to overlooked playgrounds, if you overlooked, to enable passive surveillance. People need to be able to access them from the street, things like that. So this makes sure that you have to have some communal facility that's not in the sky. And then one of the most important things, I think, which again didn't help Old Oak, but put in place some wording which suggested that when opportunity areas are being designed, they need to be consulted on, they need to involve communities in deciding about them. And in fact, Just Space have taken that forward with some new work and had some agreement from the Mayor's Regeneration Committee, or the Mayor pushed back on that. Now, where does this go in terms of kind of wider comparative politics and the thinking about how to build community engagement into comparison? So one of the things that, since I started engaging with these groups in London, really exercised me was the contrast between this reality, so here's Richard's Booker, yeah, this reality where communities are so active. Every single development or opportunity in every area in London calls forth its own community group. There are many, many, many very active and informed community groups across London. And yet, London has benefited from a kind of theorization of post-politics, post-democracy. And, one of the more recent examples of that from Eric Swingadow, suggesting that rather than think with our city postmodern ideas, that we should be critical of the kinds of initiatives that are coming forward, that really they're just answering the call of power in its post-democratic guise, which sees cynical engagement, stakeholder politics, which has not really got any opening for community contributions and so on. So it's very critical. I mean, it may be correct, but I don't think so from all this evidence and from the efforts, the continued efforts and some successes of community groups. So this was one of the questions that I was left with analytically after the time working on Just Space. And there's quite some efforts to think about Just Space and publish a few articles about their work. Here, Sharon Hayward is a person who's very involved in that, and in fact was the lead organizer on the Old Oak project that I was part of. And Richard Lee is a long-standing organizer of Just Space Network. And they suggest that there have been some successes. So Sharon suggests, yes, so for example, the tenants came up with the idea of a lifetime neighborhood, that you should have a neighborhood in which you can continue to live as you grow older, that you can access as a young person, that you find play spaces. So this leads to a livable city. And then Richard was very positive about the setting of the planning inspectors' hearings, because it meant there's an independent outside person who's using the policy framework and the policy guidance and not being driven by the mayor's political agenda or businesses' extractive policies, practices. And then Martine Drawes is a Paris-based scholar who came to do a PhD in London and did some work around an opportunity area in East London. And she was so positive about the achievements of Just Space, that Just Space and bringing different people to the table of the London plan had made other voices heard within the metropolitan context, people directly affected by the regeneration project. And she engaged a little bit with Swingadow, who's a main political theorist that informs Swingadow's analysis here. And she actually took a different view than Swingadow, thinking that this Just Space insertion of itself to the table was a perturbation in the police order, spatial and institutional order, which usually consigns community voices to a very small scale, doesn't let them influence this larger scale, ambitious policy making. So this got me thinking, and I was then drawn to some of the work of people from other parts of the world. So one of the things of the Comparative Urbanism Initiative is it suggests that we should just look somewhere else to learn, to think, to analyze, to think theoretically about our problems, not just be embedded within contexts where most scholars are living in very well-endowed contexts. So thinking into other contexts, what can we learn about politics, community engagement? And here we could take, for example, James Holston's Insurgent Citizenship. We could take the amazing work of the Shack and Slum Dwellers International and their mobilization, patient engagement, trying to get gains now. And I think that gives a different perspective to Swingado's, oh, you're just answering the call of democracy. Actually, you might be being patient, like Just Space, taking a decade to get a new sentence in the London Plan, but it's patient to achieve something for communities now. And then coming back to Hansia, I was very intrigued. Coming home one day, I always stop in the airport bookshop in Johannesburg, which is superb, and I picked up Julian Brown's book, South Africa's Insurgent Citizens, so a reference to James Holston, but also a strong engagement with Hansia. And he draws the entirely opposite conclusion to Swingado. He concludes, okay, there's many, many sides of politics, and there's many opportunities for things to be transformed, for change to happen. And even in the, what has become an increasingly dire situation in South Africa, he's still looking at the many locations where politics is possible, politics in the sense of transformative engagement. And then I was very intrigued as well to read a little bit about an approach by Lian Zhang on bargained authoritarianism. So even in contexts which seem to have little scope for community-led transformation, actually the state has to manage and engage with communities to keep the political order stable. And this is based in the Chinese context. So this becomes a little relevant in a minute when I tell you about our project that we did to take some of this forward. The next slide. Okay, so I'll share with you a little bit where this then led to. So if you just remember, I'd been doing this work in Johannesburg, and I also had been connecting with community-based groups in Johannesburg at various times and in London. And then a colleague, Fulong Wu in UCL, came along to me and said, Jenny, we must do a comparison of Africa and China. Because, of course, there's a hell of a lot of work about Chinese investments in Africa, but almost nobody taking these two contexts as reasonable sites to learn from one another. So we embarked on this, and we took as our focus large-scale development. So this has been, after the city strategies, really the next kind of wager, a way to, again, catch the different political interests that are shaping cities. So we chose 3 large-scale developments, one being Old Oak. So here was a big chance to put the politics, community politics of Old Oak into conversation with Johannesburg and with Shanghai. And we justify the comparison. So we've written a few papers about this. You could look at that. I mean, at first people would think, how can you compare these 3 very different cities, very different sizes, although they're not really. I mean, Greater Johannesburg is about 15 million. London as a functional urban region is about 22 million. Shanghai is about 24 million. So they're not vastly, it's not like you're talking about a minnow in a major metropolitan area. These are all very large, complex cities. So we based our comparison on the projects themselves. So large-scale development projects we felt large in each city. So the Shanghai one was about 800,000 in new city people. Old Oak is about maybe 25,000 times 4, maybe 100,000. So they're quite different, but in their context, they're very big. And we justified that it's the shared features of the large-scale development project that allows us to look at them. And these shared features are that they are relatively large scale. It's hard to raise the money for them. They take a long time, and they cut across many jurisdictions. So they raise quite similar political issues. And coincidentally, you have to have a good, sort of lowest common denominator reason for funders to say yes. So luckily, they all involve some kind of transport initiative. The HS2 train line, a BRT station in Johannesburg, around which there was to be some residential development, and a large deep water port trying to upgrade the economic offer of Shanghai. So in this project, we really learned a lot from each one. So this relates to my wider comparative project. There are many ways of generating comparisons. So this way of looking at shared features across different contexts, but the book goes through many other kinds of strategies. But the one thing that is common to much comparison is that you try and let one city inform the other, speak to the other. How do you learn from one to the next? And we learned a lot from each one. I think the important one for shaping something of our learning that I'll explain now. From the Chinese context, we learned that the state really is doing everything, the state. So the state's planning, regulating, investing, financing, constructing, blah, blah. So that was quite interesting. It made us look again at the London context and ask, well, what is the state doing here? Because I think quite often the London rhetoric is, oh, the developers are so greedy, these big global developers, financialization, they're all arriving, pushing over the local authorities. And we don't really look at what the state is doing. And this was one of the main findings of the community-based work, was in contesting and engaging in the local plan around the opportunity area in Old Oak. Realize that the state has as much interest, if not more, than developers in making high-rise, dense constructions so they can get the planning gain on it to enable the development to happen. So London has a hugely idiosyncratic strategy, which the red line of the opportunity area expresses very well. Draw a red line around this area, or even around an individual development. How much money can we extract from the developers to pay for that development? Otherwise, we can't pay for it at all. And that is what is leading to a lot of the terrible construction. So, I mean, at the limit, I would say developers don't care what they build, as long as they make some money. But the state needs a lot of money, £2.5 billion to make Old Oak. So it's a lot of planning gain. Huh? So, and then relevant too is that we learned from the Johannesburg case that a complex, strong electoral and community-based contestation, participation in planning and so on really drove the project there, which was to fill in the corridors around the BRT to bring communities together across racial divides and to provide housing in the center of the city. So you can read a couple of papers about that, and this just summarizes some of the learning, which maybe you'll need to look at the table a bit later, but just to highlight the community side there. So on the one hand, in Johannesburg, we had a lot of participatory planning. We had very agile planners, so tiny planning department, 2 or 3 planners, who worked with some very informed local consultants and drew developers in to do this creative work of providing very low-income housing in the center of the city. And that was also possible because of the way in which property tax funds the whole city. They could do that strategic job. In Lingang, we initially left Chinese community organizations out of our plan. We were very worried that our RA going there would get arrested or something. But as you'll see in a minute, we had to change our minds. And then in London, a lot of community engagement, and the question becomes, is this just institutionalized, routinized, post-political? What can we learn across these 3 contexts? So there's a bunch of thinking about that. So if you want to follow up on any of the papers, we've produced one paper so far which looks at the community-based groups, trying to see them not just as like a NIMBYism, but really committed to thinking about the future of the city. Many of the people in those groups will not be around when it's all built out. So many older people are involved as well. And then also some of the work on the Chinese context, which suggests we need to think a little bit more creatively about it. So we come back to this question of whether we can compare work based on community engagement. So we built this into our project in a close collaboration with the Just Space related networks in London and a close collaboration with PlanAct, which is an organization in Johannesburg which has been around since the early 1980s, which is part of the anti-apartheid movement, and now does really a lot of community-based organizing to engage in housing development and policy and so on. So here's our group in London there's a meeting where we're looking at all the different policy documents and sharing our ideas. And this is some of the activities in Johannesburg where people were drawn in to comment and think about the plan. A bit similar to here, but with a little bit more responsiveness from the local authority. And then here we have the Chinese case. So here's a remaining rural village in this area of Lingang, which is a major new satellite city linked to the port. And what we found was that instead of resisting removal, communities in Lingang were demanding to be removed, which is interesting, demanding to be moved into a place with services, not in the midst of polluting industries or without any towns around, and also demanding the compensation they would get, which is very generous, 2 flats, a retirement pension, and so on. And one of our interesting comparative moments was when some Chinese planners and planning professionals and lecturers came to the London context and stood on the street corner and looked at what was all going to be going on. And they said, well, what compensation are people going to be getting? And the answer was 0, none, nothing. So that was quite an interesting reflection for us. So we did a bit more practical stuff in terms of trying to learn across the community-based work. So here's Mike McQuella, who's a Plan Act guy. And all this happens to be Michael Edwards bending over there. And Mike McQuella presented at the main conference that Just Space held prior to the last London plan discussion. And we also linked the Old Oak work to other community groups across London at that conference. And this is also Old Oak, the Just Space had started to develop an alternative plan. So we drew our work together in that way. And then question is, we had obviously a lot of insights from the bigger project of many lines of inquiry for the research grant, but learning across Johannesburg and London in terms of community-based working, what was there to learn? We did an interview with Sharon and Mike together, reflecting, each went to the other's context, reflecting on what they learned. So it's lucky the SRC offers very strong involvement. You can put quite a lot of money into community-based work, and so we paid for quite a lot of activity with our grant. So what both shared was the challenges of large-scale developments as a focus for organizing large-scale developments and the city strategy. How do you bring together all these different communities which are really embedded in their small local context to engage in a huge project that's cutting across different communities? For Plan Act, this involved trying to work across the different communities who are affected by the BRT line. So it cut through very wealthy neighborhoods, very poor neighborhoods. So highly racialized South Africa, that means you're really trying to bring very different community interests together. For the Grand Union Alliance, which is the organization we formed in Old Oak, this also meant working across very different boroughs. People didn't even go shopping in each other's boroughs. They didn't know each other. They related to different councillors and so on. But what we found, though, positively, was that both contexts had a strong tradition of self-organizing of communities. So how can you build community voice through self-activation? It's not something that's invited by the council. I think that maybe goes back to Swingado's critique, that actually the starting point for most of the community groups across London is their own space, their own voice, and their own analysis. That was really very helpful. We found between Johannesburg and London very different relations to local government. So in Johannesburg, if you want to do work in an area as a community activist, you need to go and talk to the local councillor, the ward councillor, could be from any political party, but usually ANC. Or if it's in a more rural area, you need to talk to the traditional leader. In London, the view of different activists was that there's really no point in talking to the councillors. But no, they were drawn in at various moments anyway. And then we learned a lot from the politics in Johannesburg, where, interestingly, the electoral voice and the financial muscle of different communities meant quite a lot of participatory activity. Here's one of the meetings in London. This has quite a pale complexion, and that's because this is a meeting of people whose neighborhood were very nice little neighborhood we often stay, was going to be severely intensified, and pictures of huge high-rise buildings of very low-income housing all around were circulating. So big meeting there. But an interesting compromise was reached, which is worth telling. So just a couple of words from Sharon and Mike themselves. So Sharon saying, it's really good you were able to do grassroots stuff in Johannesburg. That is building a new organization. So Plan Act often will go into a community and start to build a community forum, activate different groups that are there and so on. Whereas what Sharon felt is that she worked together with existing groups, bringing them together in a network. And then this idea of a direct relationship between the ward council and community in Johannesburg, and no such thing in London. So to come back to the Chinese example, we learned a lot from that context in a sort of wider sense of thinking politically about the London experience. And this was, as I mentioned, that the state was the multiple roles of the state were what made the development happen. So we get a sense here of many different authorities, development agencies, and so on. Multiplicity of administrative structures, which are always shifting around to try and cope with the project needs. And then at one moment, it was not going so well in Lingang, and here Zheng Wang, who worked on the project, translates the slogan there as leading the army southwards for the final battle in Lingang, good socialist era slogan, which is basically getting the very large, very wealthy state-owned enterprises from Pudong Island, this huge new financial district we know well in Shanghai, to come and do a little bit of work in Lingang to boost it. So we had to think then with the multiple roles of the state. And that was so interesting because it gives a response, makes it possible a response to Swingado. So the state is fragmented, got different kinds of roles. Some of it is making policy, some of it is negotiating with developers, getting planning gain, or doing a development. Some of it is perhaps trying to facilitate any different actors to come in to the development. We found that very useful then to talk about settings of community engagement. Instead of taking a singular view, which Swingado does, say, well, this is all a waste of time. Somebody's just tricking you into participating and the outcome is not helpful. So with the lens of Shanghai, we look at the many different roles that the state plays, the planning system plays. So first of all, we found a situation where the community groups, and still from also the community perspective, found many valuable encounters. The policy-making process was quite open, it was very generous, the planners were very engaging. It said the OPD went out of its way to employ people who are very personable. They're very fans of them. And they felt that there were actually things in the plan that the Brand Union Alliance had motivated for. But then we found other kinds of situations, discretionary inclusion, where, for example, planning applications come in, and the planners and developers sit down and decide on the design, the finances, the viability, and planning gain, income, and so on. And that, it was a bit ambivalent. On the one hand, they set up a sort of a group of community-based people who were not the active ones. They were like forbidden from joining this, the usual suspects we left out, the ones who actually knew about development. But arbitrary people from the community were drawn into a community review group to look early at the plans and give comments. It was quite interesting because the comments of that group and other group, professional group on the early plans did align quite well with the community group. So there was a robust input to some extent, but there was little scope for community engagement on the planning applications for various reasons. And in fact, they were quite secret. So business confidentiality and so on means that the actual outcome, the design, the buildings, the infrastructure, the amount of social housing is done in secret by planners and developers. And then there were some actual barriers to participation. So for example, blew up the whole thing, basically the whole project, because not ours, but the Old Oak Park Royal Development Corporation's project, because they went behind the back of the major developers. So one car giant, a used car sales organization, owned a huge amount of land. We're going to build a large proportion of the housing and engage in building parks and all kinds of stuff. But what the development corporation did was to secretly commission a master plan which took 25% of their land as compulsory purchase order without telling them, and went to the government to get money for that. So this really broke trust in a big way, and it really unfolded very badly. And neither the developer didn't do the project. That area of the land is now out of the project, and OPDC didn't get the government money. So it was terrible, and it left a very bad feeling. So just to go through these, a couple of quotations about that. So the first one of the valued encounter, community members say things like the GUA was like a foundation course. We became quite skilled at the subjects we were engaged in. We could really contribute. And in fact, in quite a tense situation, post the car giant land being threatened with CPO, and it all became very legalistic. This is just swathes of lawyers on both sides of the planning table. And we sat at the top here, you can see this is Robin Brown, the Just Space person I worked with very closely. So myself, I did a lot of viability stuff because it was a very tense situation. Robin Brown and Henry Peterson, who was also working strongly with the neighborhood forum there, we presented the community voice into this highly difficult situation based on that level of community understanding. At the end of the day, the Grand Union Alliance assessment was quite negative in a way because of this master plan, the secret master plan process, which meant that stakeholders weren't consulted on the master plan, all kinds of changes were made, it became very complicated. But the inspector somehow let this go, major transformation in the plan. So the main areas of development, these pink bits, were lost for various reasons, and the development is now confined to more of what they call Western lands. So it was a big consequence to being so secretive. And then just to go through the pre-application planning meetings, behind closed doors, and so on, details of design and planning gain are all determined there, leading to very high density schemes. And we learned from interviews with the property developers that actually it was the planners that were pushing this higher. So we have that on good authority. The implications are that if you have a huge infrastructure need, so here, this is a slightly complicated, but let's just assume this bit of the pie, transport, massive need to put in transport infrastructure. And so you have to get a lot of money out of the planners, out of these tall buildings, extract the value to pay for the transport. And if you allow affordable housing, you get less and less money to pay for that infrastructure. So the real pressure is high density, very little affordable housing. And these are just some of the schemes. This is the worst one being done by a university near us. Universities become developer, everyone becomes a developer, everyone with a bit of land, the Serbian construction firm, the London Borough, the university, the furniture salesman, car salesperson, etc. Everyone is building these buildings. And even the planning committee members are worrying about the meaning of implications of that. And here's just to show the very low level of affordable housing. S106 is the name we give for planning gain. And they say affordable homes, this many, sounds very nice, 30%, 7% of habitable rooms. But actually this intermediate shared ownership, discount market rent, London living rent are all aimed at people who really are very well off. I mean, I can't afford this shared ownership thing, it's expensive. Affordable rent, social rent, they built only 61 houses out of the whole lot. So the money is not going to where it's needed, according to people, and the community groups become increasingly agitated and sending letters galore to the plan, to the mayor, to the committees, to the OPDC, etc., and really, really trying to contest these buildings, which are coming up next to in their neighborhood with next to no services. So to sum up, there were some successes. We managed to get some things into the planning process, a statement committing to community involvement, for example, was an early and big success, and a new place was implemented, which was a mixed-use place linked to most of the residences in the area, so that was something they wanted. But some were not so successful, and this was really very contested. Initially, the first plan said that next to the neighborhoods with their terraced houses around the development, they would taper the high rise. But, so next to your 2-story residence would be not a 55-story skyscraper, but something slowly increasing in height. And actually that was completely overturned. And those areas became the legible gateways to the development, and a lot of high rise right next to developments. So politically, what did we learn? And I think this is political learning from within the community activity and also from the perspective of thinking with Shanghai. So the London example suggests that we need to think strategically across different settings of community engagement. Where is something open and positive? So the hunch about engaging in the planning process, very positive. Where is it really closed off? Secretive sessions where the actual decisions about the nature of the built form are made, long-term consequences for the city we live in. So ways to try and push at that, push at the process of negotiation where the planners are just making it up. I mean, there might as well be, I don't know, some highly informalized, very corrupt place. Nobody has any control over it. So how can we make that more open? And how could we perhaps analytically, instead of saying that the London cases are leading only to reinforce this post-democratic cynical order, politically, how could we think positively about the way in which what Hans here calls the torsion or twist that causes politics occur might as well be the local resident as a revolutionary movement in a city square somewhere. So I had a couple of other points, which I'm not sure I will make with the slides because we run out of time, but just to say, where could we take this? So the question is in the next slide. Well, how can we perhaps think about this? How can changes be made in the vernacular form of the planning system, not just its formal process? So how things are happening behind the scenes, informally, through an unscripted arrangement? Is it good to perhaps go and look in other contexts where we have very different kinds of processes? So here's one of our researchers on a new grant, Making Africa Urban, Wilfred Jana, who works in Lilongwe, Malawi, found this great picture which shows before the election, lots of money coming your way if you're a community member, literally. After the election, the politicians are strangling you to get money for themselves. So it's very complex electoral politics, very different range of actors, development organizations, striker, Chinese government, the World Bank, all kinds of crooks. There's some big corrupt South African developer trying to get his hands on a lot of Malawian money. So really a very different context for community and planning processes, which currently we're thinking a little bit about that. And maybe how could we bring that back to London? Maybe. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I thought that was wonderful, and I've really pushed Jenny to go back to her very early career in South Africa and kind of think through how she became who she is today, because I think it's really interesting in terms of career trajectory. So we have a wonderful discussant now, Liza Weinstein, who's both the department chair and associate professor of sociology in the sociology and anthropology department at Northeastern, so not too far from us. She teaches and researches on cities and globalization, urban political economy, politics of informality, with a regional focus on India. Her 2014 book, The Durable Slum, Dharavi and the Right to Stay Put in Globalizing Mumbai, examined the Indian state's changing response to residential informality in the context of economic globalization and global city formation. And she's currently, I think, as we were talking about the other night, completing a book on evictions and particularly evictions activism in India. So perfect discussant for Jenny's talk. So over to Liza.
Excellent. Thank you, Loretta. And thank you for inviting me to be the discussant. It's sort of an effort that we're taking that I think is well represented in the audience today to strengthen the cross-institutional conversations that we're having on urban politics, urban theory, urban studies in the Boston area, really picking up the model that Jenny and Loretta helped develop in London and bring it to Boston as a Boston urban salon. So I think that partly explains why I'm sitting here discussing today as opposed to someone from BU, but I'm really excited to see folks from MIT, UMass Boston, Northeastern, as well as BU and elsewhere here. So thank you, Jenny, for that really rich and engaging talk. It demonstrated so effectively your ability to think across places and to build theory broadly through policy mobilities, through learning from other places, but also the deep specificity that one really needs to be able to theorize from context. As a quick aside, I mean, your writings about this and your thinkings about this has been so influential in my own work for my entire career. Your book, Ordinary Cities, came out in 2006 when I had just gotten back from doing field work in India. And here I was with all of this like field notes on Mumbai and all of these like political machinations around large scale redevelopment projects underway in Mumbai. And my advisor, who absolutely no shade, my really wonderful and inspiring advisor, Saskia Sassen, was doing this very big theory across places and really thinking about how we kind of build from the local. And your book, Ordinary Cities, came in this moment where I really wanted to be thinking also about how do you think from places, and that this idea of a model felt a little at odds, and it wasn't the comfortable place that I felt like I needed to be building theory from. And Ordinary Cities really helped me think about how do you theorize from place, and about the specificities of place that you illustrated so well today. So my questions and comments sort of flow from that, but particularly three themes that I think have been really important in my own thinking and I've drawn from you so deeply. And the first one really is about theory produced from context. And as you spoke today about the specificity of the particular places within which you and your research team have been doing research, you also began with your discussion of your own academic biography and your connectedness to certain places. And as urbanists, we often think about the places that are in our imaginaries. We're always doing comparative work, even if we're only doing research in one place. We're thinking about the other cities we've been in. We're thinking about the places in which we grew up. And so as my first question, I wondered if you could speak a little bit about your own sort of urban biography and how it shaped the work that you've done here, and particularly the work that you've done in London. As you have contributed to conversations, really important conversations in global urban studies around sort of new geographies of theory and the geographies from which we think from, which are the places from which we develop theory, which are the places in which theory gets applied. I see a lot of resonances of your work in Johannesburg and perhaps even earlier reflected in how you do research in London. And if you could maybe humor us a little bit with a little more background on your academic trajectory from Durban through Johannesburg to London, and some of these. So I have a couple of other questions, but rather than making you think about my questions in advance.
Great, thanks. Well, that's a nice question for me because it reminds me of the interview. So the book that I mentioned in the beginning, with Sophie Oldfield and Clive Barnett came to interview me in London and asking me some of these questions about my earlier biography, and actually made me think a little harder about this question. So one of their questions was, well, you know, when you come to start critiquing the global cities theory with, you know, from cities off the map, you know, I talk about the way in which Durban was a place in which that was important for me. But they pressed me to think about my master's and PhD work, which is done in the Eastern Cape in South Africa. And the main city I looked at there was Port Elizabeth. And part of the reason for going to do work there was because it wasn't talked about much in South African historiography. And so to this day, Durban and Port Elizabeth are not prominent in discussions of South African urban history and politics. So that was one of the reasons why I went to work there. And it was also Port Elizabeth was a very important center for ANC and other political organizations' work in the 1950s and earlier and ongoing. So it was a very interesting city to look at, and a pity not to be thought of more. In Durban, I think this was, you know, I would often be sitting on the beach in Durban, and the activity on the beach, aside from reading the newspaper, staring, blah, blah, was counting the ships waiting to go into the harbour. It's a very busy harbour that serves much of sub-Saharan Africa, certainly Johannesburg's needs. And there were always 30-odd ships sitting out waiting to go into the harbour. It's very busy, very big natural harbour. So it felt to me very odd that Durban wouldn't be a global city. Felt highly connected to the world. And, one could think about Durban and Johannesburg perhaps as, was one metropolitan space in terms of its global integration. So that was, for me, a very important motivation for the Ordinary Cities book. Another motivation was moving to London, where I worked first at the LSE, and I was asked to teach something about urban development. And obviously, because I was coming from a so-called third world country, I was meant to teach about development and how South Africa needed to be saved by development. And actually, I felt very strongly that I was not allowed, or almost forbidden by both staff and students to talk about the cultural politics, the dynamism, the histories of modernity that were part of our ordinary repertoire of talking about South African cities. So those were really the coincidence of things that led to the Ordinary Cities book. And it's really been one of the biggest pleasures of my career that book is quite well read, because I think it's well read by people who are all sitting on some place in their own context and feeling frustrated with the need to make a space analytically for their own urban experiences. So yeah, I think that's perhaps is that okay?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you for sharing all of that. That's very much appreciated. I also wanted to talk a little bit, or was hoping you could help us think through a little bit theory, as theorizing is an activity. And one of the things that I've always appreciated your writing is your self-reflexivity and your sort of your description of the work that's actually entailed in this. That theory isn't something that just kind of emerges from nowhere, but it's sort of an active practice. And and I've noticed in some of your writings on comparative cities, you have been sort of more cautious about how you talk about theory building from comparative research. So not, I think, to scare people off. Theory often feels like it's this, big T thing, but you also describe these very localized details, and that I think are often at odds, or can be thought of at odds, with how we think about building theory. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the specificity and the theory, and the ways that these connect up, the ways that we can build theory from these very local incarnations, or from the specificities of place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm just really trying to think how I can make a connection with the content
Right.
of today. But
Right.
well, I guess the content comes back to this, which has been an arc of since I was learning in the 1980s. As I mentioned, from Jeff McCarthy, urban development politics has been the abiding focus, and I suppose that's been more lately something that I've really tried to engage with critically, the inheritance tracks of urban development politics, which could be things like the growth machines or regime politics, the format where you have a municipality engaging with globally circulating things, and leading us to quite a lot of focus on municipal politics. And our latest project about African cities really just throws that into such relief, because for all the stuff about rolling out the Sustainable Development Goals, capacitating local government, across African contexts, local government is weak and debilitated by the urban turn. The urban turn brings masses of money, infrastructure, investments, development, many actors, and national governments, ministries, state actors from the president to the lowly official see this as a big opportunity to consolidate their power, to consolidate their personal wealth, to consolidate programs in their particular government. So in fact, the urban turn has not capacitated cities, undermined cities. So if we work with the architecture of that earlier theorizing, we end up in a not very effective place. So there's a very suggestive paper, for example, in the Annals of American Geographers by two great younger scholars, I think, I can't remember their first names, Bigger and Weber. And they draw on that kind of architecture, circulating idea of the World Bank's resilience agenda, green structural adjustment, somehow leading cities to become financialized, to become capacitated, to be actors in this wider world. But actually our research and many other scholars which agree shows that's just not happening. So we need another perspective on that. And we need to start thinking about transscalarity, how many different actors across many scales work together. I like to draw on Ludovic Albert's work about transscalar territorial networks. Looking at the large-scale developments gives you a very different perspective of how different actors come together to make urban outcomes. So that we need to leave behind some of that earlier architecture. And I think that's a theme running through a lot of the work I was talking about here. I mean, I think in terms of how we might consider theory, in writing the comparative urbanism book, I started using concepts. I thought they were a bit littler, and so rather than a theory in which somebody proposes some very grand perspective, which is kind of quite well structured and so on, and then we must all struggle to understand it, borrow it, try and apply it, usually find it everywhere. How could we make a space where all of our observations could find an audience, find a voice, find a presence in debates, not dominated by this very weighty theory? So, this sort of call for revisability based on experiences and analysis in any part of the world means that we have to cut this theory down to size. And so I tried to develop a series of engagements with different perspectives. So this is not to say there's one broader philosophical perspective that's correct. I try and work with political economy, Marxism, Weber, Foucault, with actor network theory, and I have drawn a lot from Deleuzean philosophical thinking about how concepts come to be formed in some complex dramatic engagement between us as knowing subjects and the world is jumping out and presenting itself to us and being dynamic too. It's a very long drama, but what it leads to is an understanding that in that process of encounter and engagement, concepts emerge. They would emerge perhaps as a multiplicity, that there'd be many possible concepts that could come into being. They needn't be unrelated. It's not to make a joke, like some people might try and make one theory per phenomenon. No, there's a lot of different ways of thinking conceptually about phenomena and opening up a conversation about them. And part of the process that Deleuze talks about is precisely the already existing conversations that we can't avoid when we come to try and know something. We already have many things in our head, many experiences, many people we are implicitly talking to. So for me, that's such an important thing. It's from theory to concepts and opening up a conversation where nobody's going to really know everything that's going on. We can't know every place. We can't bring every initiative together, but the conversation, a modest conversation, creative, but not trying to dominate the whole world with our theories.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. My final question, and then we'll open up for conversation, and I'd love to hear what others have to say, but is really about your title and how you started your talk today with tensions and the degree to which there are, in fact, tensions between comparative theorizing, comparative urban studies, thinking across places, drawing theory from place, and the types of very localized engagements, connections and trust building that is entailed in community-based research, and really how you see that tension, because as you mentioned today, and you open your comparative urbanism book by talking about comparative as one comparative methods, as one particular approach to sort of answering the call you made in ordinary cities, actually thinking from places rather than thinking on top of places. And community-based research is another. And it also thinks from places and builds theory from locality. And I wonder how much you see that tension, or whether there is in fact a tension there, or because one area where I see the tension potentially arising, and I'm doing comparative work across India with housing rights activists, is their interests are tied to the location. And their interests aren't about your theorizing across contexts. They want to achieve the goals and the campaigns in which they're invested. And granted, in a bigger sense, there are larger campaigns and larger structures of power within which they understand they're embedded, but their interests are local. And is there, that is one potential site of tension.
No, I think thank you for coming back to that. It's like
Maybe
needed a
quickish
conclusion.
answer so we can open things, but
Okay, I'll be quite quick. So, I think you say you're working through housing rights activists, which at a national scale might be linked up across different contexts. So actually there's often community organizations that are interested in joining up across the national context, internationally, SDI and so on. So learning across contexts is very feasible, and also many activists are also quite aware of what's going on in other places, and the Just Space is learning across huge places like London, as many people in London as Switzerland. So, it's a kind of very big effort to do that. I think one of the things would be that I learned from processes I've been involved in is that the collaboration is really important across different contexts, which speaks not only to comparative research on community organizations, but also any comparative research, that the real benefit of building insights across different contexts is working with scholars from different contexts, not becoming the one, I get masses of money and I swan about the world and I talk about everywhere. That's not really the solution. The solution is how to build scholarly capacity and engage and build voices and learn from people in different places. So it's about the scholars as much as the ideas and scholarship. And so that has been really the great joy of both grants I've been involved in, and to be clear, these are the only 2 grants I've ever had. So the one, especially at the moment, working with African-based scholars, we're so lucky to have really very smart, very able scholars who know their context extremely well, and so building understandings is a collaboration. So I strongly encourage that for community-based work, because that's essential. You have long lifetime commitments and engagements in places, so you need collaboration, but also about scholarly production. So that was quick, yeah?
That was wonderful.
Okay.
I'm just conscious that time's ticking on, we've got drinks.
We can also just open the reception if we want to do informal conversation.
Yeah, do you want to just, people got urgent questions?
Let's take a round of questions, shall we? And then we can. There's one next to you on the other side.
Oh.
Yeah, so I'm very curious, when you're doing research with communities, are there some communities you run into that just have less capacity to be able to do research? They don't have the same institutions set up, so they don't really have representatives to come to meetings, they don't have the same kind of a professional or academic language so they can engage with the planning process? And if so, do you see your role as an academic as maybe helping them build out that capacity?
Well, I think it's very much a two-way street, yeah. So I often feel very unknowledgeable, learn a lot, but we have skills which we can bring to that process and learn together. So that would be my biggest advice. Jump in and be the one who doesn't know, but we all bring our skills together. Yeah.
I'm curious, thank you so much for this. So you're talking, very much primarily about the, research context of working with community-based groups, and I'm thinking about, other stakeholders in the planning and development process, which are planners themselves, and I think we're seeing a lot more cities and institutions who are forming like community engagement roles, and I'm curious what you think the role of community engagement in that institution, that planning institution, can play, whether in concert with community groups or whether there's too big of a risk of kind of extraction from the community groups if the planners themselves are leading the engagement process.
Yeah. Do you want to take a couple together? Or?
Yeah, we don't want to go too far because we've got loads of food and drink. We don't want to. Let's maybe take that question and that question, maybe answer all 3 together.
Okay.
Sorry,
thank
go
you
here.
for your presentation. I was wondering, because you have done work on so many different places, what is your theory of the state now?
A small question. A little tiny
I want to
question.
ask a hard question.
Final question, and then you can ask whatever you want when we have the
Yeah, sure. I think it's kind of similar to both of those. But you talked about the state and you talked about insurgent citizenship a little bit. And so I'm kind of wondering, especially in the context of these very different countries with very different governments and different local relationships to government, I think, like different opinions of the government, what the balance you think is of people doing things through official channels like planning, and people, I guess, building their own space, or I'm thinking kind of like occupations and things like that, or just, yeah, the balance of going through the state and through government, and how that reflects and fits in with people trying to make their own space.
Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't see those as at odds with one another. So people building their own space and then engaging. I mean, I guess I'm a little more inclined to think, let's take to the streets, make some banners. But the sort of format of political engagement in London is usually more modest than that, although it can lead to legal processes. Loretta's been involved in that, certainly to protests or campaigning. So all those are possible. And I think what is the point of thinking across many different contexts is that you open up a discussion about what it is you think you're seeing. And you might see something different from another angle, from another perspective. You might start to look at something somewhat differently. So in the UK, where there's very formal planning process, very clear regulations, quite bureaucratic, actually at the heart of the planning system is a highly informalized, secretive process over which there's no accountability. It's ridiculous. But we would not have seen that or had the words to see it without coming through some other contexts, in my view. But others might have got there very differently. So, I think we can learn from one another without disabusing ourselves of the differences, different structural conditions, authoritarian. So we took, 3 very different contexts, late democracy, an early democratizing context, and a authoritarian or bargained authoritarian process. So you don't take away from those, but that looking down at the urban, you can look at a range of different ways in which urban politics is configured. And the variety is what we need to bring to our theoretical project as urbanists, not being stuck in thinking with some repertoire from a certain place. So you have to do that with care, which I think takes me back to the theory of the state. And I just
in one sentence.
I can do it very fast. Because luckily we've been talking about this a lot in our latest project. So, the state, and here I've also learned an awful lot from a PhD student, Barbara Carapido, who's working on Romania. So state theory is not so secure. So what is the state in any broad theoretical question? It's an institution, it's an idea. It's not stable analytically for even the grand state theorists. But if you come at the question of state from an African perspective, this has long been in question. We have abandoned the state as a theoretical object for a very long time, rather talking about negotiated forms of public authority, twilight institutions, which Christian Land talks about. So the formation of political power, stateness, public authority is something that's highly emergent. But unlike with Jessup, we wouldn't say that emergent relationality equals state. What does it equal? It equals theft, or it equals advancing the interests of some particular section of a government or party. What are we looking at in terms of power relations? And I would say the state can become an actively unhelpful term for understanding politics. So that's my short form.
So listen, we have half an hour till we have to kind of dissipate. We've got food, we've got drink, we can have more questions and discussion, we can mingle, we can do whatever we want. But I'd just like to say a massive thank you both to Jenny, but also